So without further ado, let's say hello to employment lawyer David Martyn from Thompsons Solicitors. What sort of questions are people asking you? I mean, obviously the government is providing this money, but this is a situation that people have never found themselves in before, so they might well be concerned about, what happens when it ends.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we had the first stage of this, the question was, practically how are employers going to choose who's going on furlough? How's the scheme going to work itself? Are companies actually going to be paid? And in turn, are they going to pass the money on to their employees? We've now moved on from that stage. I think the stage we're now at, which is perhaps the hardest bit of this process, is how do we work the transition from the government having stepped in and provided the support, moving on to that next stage of incrementally and gradually sort of trying to rebuild the economy, trying to bring people back into work. The kind of levels of pay that the government will continue to subsidise. These are the fine details which I think in retrospect Rishi Sunak's probably going to be judged on, and when we look back on this in a few years. So I think that, terrific job, frankly. I think that would be agreed by all sides so far in terms of the implementation of the scheme, but how you get out of the scheme and retain jobs and stimulate the economy is a really important bit, because frankly it may not have been worth the effort unless this second bit of the process is implemented successfully.
Well, let's get to some of the texts and questions that the listeners have been sending. John has tweeted, he says, David, probably one for you. Why are staff returning to businesses after furlough with full holiday entitlement in place? If we all must do our part and business share the burden, why can't the staff do that as well?
Well, there's no requirement for employers to effectively give people full holiday entitlements when they return from work. What we've seen a lot of employers do is take a fairly responsible approach to this and say to people, look, employers have the power to effectively say to employees, with relevant notice, we effectively request that you take a period of holiday during this week or that week. So employers can ask employees, in fact force employees, to use up some of their holiday entitlement. Now, that applies even when the individual is on furlough. Now, it does raise some interesting questions, because quite often a lot of employee representatives have said, well, it isn't really a holiday if you're stuck at home on furlough and you're not allowed to go out your house and all the lockdown restrictions are in place. But I think most employment lawyers would say that employers can oblige their employees to use up some of their holiday while they're on furlough. Now, I don't think they can require people to use up all of their holidays. I think that would probably be an unreasonable approach that an employer took. But what we've seen most employers doing is saying, look, if you're going to be furloughed for six months of the year, then we would expect you to either voluntarily take 6 months of your holiday, or we may oblige you to take 6 months of your holiday during that period when you're furloughed, so that when you come back to work, you're not going to be in this kind of unnatural position of having stored up all this holiday. And
that's the same for those of us who are going out to work. John, who tweeted in, we're all being asked to take our holidays as per usual, even though we've got nowhere to go and no way of getting there.
Yeah.
And David, here's another question. This is from Dave in Hilltrek. He says, the government support's helped my small business, but I can't understand why the part-time furlough can't start now. It would allow small companies to gradually bring back employees. For example, job share, which would maintain social distance. He says, I'm sure that companies have enough work to employ part-time, but not full-time in some roles. I appreciate that would cause issues and increased travel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very telling that the job retention scheme is going to, I think they have listened to these requests for part-time work to be allowed, particularly when we look about we look ahead to the transition into the economy hopefully restarting. I think probably, to be fair to the government, the reason why they have taken quite binary approach to this is just for the sake of simplicity. I think there's always been a balance within the government's approach to this to say, we're having a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to every single business, whether or not they're in hospitality or whether in some sort of support business which may be able to function to some extent. And I think what the government's always trying to avoid is to balance that broader approach against the possibility of abuse. Because I think there is a concern that if you were to allow part-time work, from the outset of the scheme, then we may have employers who are bringing people in to do more work effectively than they were declaring, and yet those individuals were being fully paid by the state. And I think this is why it's going to be difficult when, or certainly the rules are going to have to be very carefully considered when they come in at the beginning of August, to monitor how employers are going to be declaring the amount of hours that people are working part-time. And I think also we have a real issue around, we simply don't know how much of a contribution employers are going to be asked to make to this. Because it may very well be that one of the conditions, because I think it's been very positive that there's going to be a scheme in August, but it may be that one of the conditions of the scheme is that employers make a minimum contribution at a certain level. Now, we do know that might not be possible for some employers at the beginning of August, and that will raise some difficult questions. So I think in relation to part-time work, I think it's been recognised that needs to happen, but I just think it's the detail of that and the provisions that need to be put in place to prevent any abuse that's probably causing the hesitation at this stage.
This one, David says, I started a new job as a delivery driver in February. I was let go just as lockdown began. But at the same time, I was about 3 weeks away from opening my late father's pub. Now my only option is universal credit. But is there anything I can do to retain my staff?
I think in terms of retaining your staff in his late father's pub, I think we need a bit more information about exactly what the position was in terms of what happened. If these individuals were employed at the moment, then they could be put on furlough. And one of the things about the furlough scheme is it has allowed retrospective application, which means that even if you've been made unemployed, before the scheme came into place, quite unusually, HMRC have said, well, look, actually, your old employer can take you back on. And, even if you've already been made unemployed, you can be taken back on, even if there's been a gap in your service, and you can still apply for furlough. I think the difficulty that has been created by that system is for employers to take people back on. I think this relates to the previous question we heard as well. For employers to be motivated to re-employ people, there isn't really much in it for them because it's effectively a cost-neutral process. So while the government has always said, well, look, if you were dismissed I think after the 28th of February, and you aren't eligible by way of a new job, then your old employer can take you back on. I think that's all very well, but in reality, a lot of old employers are thinking, well, if we take somebody back on, then we have a contractual relationship with this individual. We're not really benefiting financially from doing that. There may be costs associated with running payroll, etc. So while the opportunity has always been there in theory, in practice we haven't seen many employers take up that opportunity, which has been a disappointing feature of the scheme. I think there needed to be a degree of incentivisation there for employers to take people back on and to re-employ them in those circumstances.
Another interesting text here, which is along the same lines, David. It's anonymous. It says, my partner works in a factory. He works full-time but is paid through an agency. Before the work broke up, he was told by the agency he would receive furlough. They're now saying they're waiting for clarification from the government and he hasn't been paid anything. They paid him his holiday pay, saying this would be paid back when furlough came through, but it looks like he might not get it as he's also losing holiday pay.
Yeah, I think the difficulty for an agency worker, and we don't know much about his details, but it's very likely that he was employed not on a permanent basis. So effectively he was employed as required, on an as required basis. Now that meant that the agency didn't have any obligation, or is unlikely to have had any obligation to provide him with further work. Now, it would have been open to the agency to say, well, let's assume that you would have been provided with further work and we are going to make an application to the job retention scheme for your salary for this period. Now, that is something that was open to that agency to do, and it's still open to the agency to do that. But a lot of agencies haven't done that, the reason being that they fear that if they commit to that with their workers, that they may not get the money back from the job retention scheme. I would hope that in this circumstance, the more people have become familiar with the operation of the job retention scheme, the fact that it works, the fact that people, businesses are actually seeing money in their bank accounts coming from HMRC, that people will, agencies will be encouraged to take up that opportunity, because one of the good things of the scheme is that it applied to everyone, even 0 hours workers, people who weren't, who didn't have that right to continued permanent employment. The scheme was broad. It's just some employers haven't quite taken up that opportunity.
David, I've one very quick final one for you. I'm hoping it's a quick answer, I don't know. Would it be complex to rotate employees on furlough now so that those who've been on furlough can come back and others can take their place?
No, the scheme allows for that, and I think it's also something the government would encourage. I think people on furlough need to be engaged if they're going to be brought back into the business. So where it's possible to furlough people, it's entirely consistent with the scheme to do that.